When Clara Whitmore begged, "Please don't look at me," she never imagined those words would save her life. In 1887, Wyoming, a widow's shame, becomes her shield. A mysterious gunman's past collides with her present, and the Blackwood Empire's 15-year reign of terror finally meets its match. What happens when the hunted become the hunters? Stay with me until the end of this 5-part saga and comment your city below so I can see how far this Wild West tale travels across the world. The August sun beat down on Cheyenne's dusty main street like the hammer of an angry god, and Clara Whitmore stood in its merciless glare, wishing the earth would swallow her whole. Her black mourning dress clung to her trembling frame, soaked with perspiration and tears she refused to shed in public. Around her a crowd had gathered like vultures circling carrion, their faces a mixture of morbid curiosity and barely concealed satisfaction at witnessing a Boston lady's humiliation. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the murmur of the crowd, "please, don't look at me." But they did look. They stared as Colonel Gideon Blackwood's booming voice carried across the square, each word a nail in the coffin of her dignity. They watched as his eldest son Marcus held up the deed to her late husband's ranch with theatrical flourish. They gawked as the younger son Noah shifted uncomfortably behind his father, his conscience clearly at war with his loyalty. "By the authority vested in me by the territorial government," Colonel Blackwood declared, his silver mustache gleaming in the sunlight, "I hereby claim the Whitmore property for unpaid debts and water rights violations. The widow has 30 days to vacate the premises." Clara's legs nearly buckled. Thomas had been dead only 3 months, taken by consumption that had ravaged his lungs through the harsh Wyoming winter. She'd barely had time to grieve, let alone understand the labyrinthine web of contracts and obligations he'd left behind. Now this public execution of her remaining dignity. "That's impossible," she managed, her cultured Boston accent cutting through the Western drawl surrounding her. "My husband paid his debts. We have receipts. Receipts can be forged, ma'am," Marcus Blackwood interrupted with a cold smile. "And debts to the Blackwood Cattle Company take precedence over any personal arrangements your husband might have made." The crowd pressed closer, their whispers like the buzz of carrion flies. Clara caught fragments of their conversations. "Should have stayed back east. No place for a lady alone. Blackwoods always get what they want." Each word was a lash across her already bleeding pride. She closed her eyes, fighting the wave of nausea that threatened to overwhelm her. This couldn't be happening. Not here, not like this. When she'd married Thomas 5 years ago and followed him to this godforsaken territory, she'd thought herself brave, adventurous even. Now she felt like nothing more than a foolish girl who'd wandered too far from home. "The lady seems distressed," came a voice from the edge of the crowd, low and measured, carrying the kind of quiet authority that made people step aside without quite knowing why. Clara's eyes snapped open to see the crowd parting like the Red Sea. Through the gap walked a man who seemed to carry shadows with him despite the blazing sun overhead. Tall and lean with prematurely silver hair beneath a black hat, he moved with the fluid grace of a predator. His coat was dusty from hard travel, and his boots bore the scars of countless miles. But it was his eyes that made Clara's breath catch pale blue like winter ice, and holding depths of pain that matched her own. "Jonas Carter," someone in the crowd whispered, and Clara heard the mixture of awe and fear in the voice. Colonel Blackwood's face darkened like a thundercloud. "This is none of your concern, Carter. Move along." The stranger Carter continued his approach, his spurs ringing against the packed earth with each measured step. "Seems to me," he said, his voice carrying a slight southern drawl that spoke of education and breeding, "that when a lady's in distress, it becomes every gentleman's concern." Marcus Blackwood stepped forward, his hand hovering near the ivory-handled Colt at his hip. "The lady is a debtor, nothing more. The law's been satisfied and justice served." Carter's lips curved in what might have been a smile, but there was no warmth in it. "Justice." He tasted the word like something bitter. Funny how justice in this territory always seems to favor the same family. The tension in the air grew thick enough to cut with a knife. Clara found herself holding her breath, caught between hope and terror. She didn't know this man, had never seen him before, but something in his manner suggested he was not a man to cross lightly. "You're walking a dangerous line, Carter." Colonel Blackwood growled, his own hand now resting on his weapon. "I suggest you reconsider your position." I've considered it carefully, Carter replied, taking another step closer to Clara. She could smell leather and gunpowder and something indefinably masculine that made her pulse quicken despite her fear. And I find myself wondering about the legality of these proceedings. Has the lady been given proper representation? Has she had opportunity to examine the alleged debts? Or are we simply meant to take the word of the Blackwood Cattle Company that all is as it should be? A murmur ran through the crowd. Clara saw doubt flickering in some faces, though whether it was doubt about the Blackwoods' methods or Carter's sanity she couldn't tell. The paperwork is in order, Marcus said, but his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. I'm sure it is, Carter agreed. The Blackwoods have always been thorough in their paperwork. Every deed transfer, every water rights claim, every convenient death that clears the way for new acquisitions, all properly documented, I'm certain. The words hung in the air like an accusation. Colonel Blackwood's face had gone white with rage, and Clara saw his hand tighten on his gun grip. That's enough, the colonel snarled. You're speaking treason against upstanding citizens of this territory. Am I? Carter asked mildly. He'd positioned himself between Clara and the Blackwoods now, and she could see the careful way he balanced his weight, ready to move in any direction at a moment's notice. I'm merely expressing concern for proper legal procedure. Surely you support the rule of law, Colonel? It was then that Clara noticed something that made her blood run cold. Around the edges of the crowd, she could see other men, hard-faced individuals who bore no resemblance to the curious townspeople. They wore the look of professional gunfighters, and they were slowly, carefully positioning themselves to surround Carter. Without thinking, she stepped forward and placed her hand on Carter's arm. The muscle beneath the fabric was iron-hard, coiled like a spring ready to release. Mr. Carter, she said quietly, her voice steady despite the chaos in her heart. I appreciate your concern, but perhaps this isn't the time or place. His pale eyes met hers, and for a moment she felt as if he could see straight through to her soul. Sometimes, ma'am, it's exactly the right time and place. Sometimes a line has to be drawn. And sometimes, came a new voice from across the square. A man needs to know when he's outnumbered. Everyone turned to see a mountain of a man approaching Sullivan, the bounty hunter whose reputation preceded him like the stench of death. Standing well over 6 feet and built like a bull, he wore his scars like badges of honor. His coat was open, despite the heat revealing the twin colts that had ended more lives than most men could count. Carter didn't flinch, but Clara felt the tension in his arm increase. Sullivan, he acknowledged with a nod. Still taking Blackwood money, I see. Money's money, Sullivan replied with a shrug that made his massive shoulders roll like boulders. And you're worth a lot of it, dead or alive. There's a bounty on you, Clara whispered, her hand still on Carter's arm. Several, Carter admitted without taking his eyes off Sullivan. Turns out standing up to powerful men makes you unpopular with powerful friends. The crowd was backing away now, sensing that violence was about to erupt. Clara wanted to run every instinct screaming at her to flee, but something kept her rooted to the spot. Perhaps it was pride she'd been humiliated enough for one day. Perhaps it was desperation this man might be her only hope of salvaging something from the wreckage of her life. Or perhaps it was something else entirely. Something she didn't want to examine too closely. This doesn't have to end in blood, Colonel Blackwood said, though his tone suggested he wouldn't mind if it did. Carter, you ride out of town right now, and we'll pretend this conversation never happened. The lady can settle her debts in the traditional manner, and everyone goes home happy. Traditional manner? Carter's voice had dropped to a dangerous whisper. Marcus Blackwood stepped forward with an oily smile. The widow could always consider a more personal arrangement. A woman of her obvious refinement could find herself very comfortable as part of the right household, protected, provided for. The words hit Clara like a physical blow. The implication was clear: become a kept woman, a mistress, or lose everything. Her face burned with shame and rage, and she felt something crack inside her chest. No, she said, her voice ringing across the suddenly silent square. I will not be any man's chattel, and I will not be driven from my husband's land by threats and intimidation. Carter turned to look at her, and she saw something like approval in those winter-pale eyes. Well said, ma'am. "This is your last warning, Carter," Colonel Blackwood snarled. "Leave now or face the consequences." Carter was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving from the colonel to his sons, to Sullivan, to the hired guns positioned around the square. Clara held her breath, waiting for his decision. Finally, he spoke. "Mrs. Whitmore, would you do me the honor of accompanying me to my horse? I believe you and I have some things to discuss." He offered her his arm with old-world courtesy, as if they were promenading through a Boston park rather than walking through a potential killing ground. Clara took it gratefully, drawing strength from his steady presence. They began to walk toward the edge of the square, the crowd parting before them like wheat before a scythe. Behind them, Clara could hear Colonel Blackwood's voice, low and furious. "This isn't over, Carter. Not by a long shot." Carter didn't turn around, but his voice carried clearly in the desert air. "No, Colonel, I don't believe it is." They reached Carter's horse, a magnificent black stallion that watched their approach with intelligent eyes. Carter helped Clara up behind him with gentle hands, then swung into the saddle with fluid grace. "Where are we going?" she asked, her arms circling his waist as he gathered the reins. "Somewhere safe," he replied. "Somewhere we can talk without an audience." As they rode out of Cheyenne, Clara looked back over her shoulder to see the Blackwoods still standing in the square surrounded by their hired guns. The crowd was dispersing, but slowly, reluctantly, as if they sensed they'd witnessed something significant. "Why did you help me?" she asked as the town fell away behind them. Carter was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely audible over the horse's hoofbeats. "Because 15 years ago I stood in a similar square and watched my own family's dignity get trampled under Blackwood boots. Because sometimes the right thing to do is also the necessary thing. And because—" he paused, his voice growing even softer. "No woman should have to beg people not to look at her when she's done nothing wrong." They rode in silence after that, heading toward the distant mountains where Carter's ranch waited. Behind them, dust clouds marked the passage of other riders, Sullivan and his men following at a distance like wolves trailing wounded prey. But for the moment, Clara felt something she hadn't experienced in months: hope. It was fragile and uncertain, like a candle flame in a high wind, but it was there nonetheless. Whatever came next, she wouldn't face it alone. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western peaks when Carter finally spoke again. "Mrs. Whitmore, I should tell you the men who helped me today, my allies, some of them aren't what you might expect. And the battle we're about to fight, it's been brewing for a very long time. If you want to change your mind, if you want me to take you to the railroad station instead, I'll understand." Clara tightened her grip around his waist, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing. "Mr. Carter, I've lost my husband, my home, and my dignity all in the space of 3 months. I have nothing left to lose and everything to gain. Whatever you're planning, I want to be part of it." She felt rather than saw his smile. "In that case, ma'am, welcome to the war." As if summoned by his words, a figure emerged from the rocks ahead, a Cheyenne warrior on a painted pony, his long black hair streaming in the wind. He raised his hand in greeting, and Carter returned the gesture. "Two Hawks," Carter called out as they approached. "Any sign of trouble on the back trail?" The warrior's face was impassive, but his dark eyes glittered with something that might have been anticipation. "Many riders follow," he said in accented English. "The buffalo soldier leads them." "Sullivan," Carter said grimly. "How many?" 10, maybe 12. They move like men who know their prey." Clara felt a chill run down her spine despite the heat. "Buffalo soldier. It's what the Cheyenne call Sullivan," Carter explained. "They respect his fighting ability even if they despise what he uses it for." Two Hawks nudged his pony closer, studying Clara with frank curiosity. "This is the woman who stands against the black-hearted one." "She is," Carter confirmed. "Mrs. Whitmore, meet Two Hawks, war chief of the Northern Cheyenne and the best tracker in the territory." The warrior nodded gravely. "Any enemy of Blackwood is welcome in our lodge fires. The widow has courage. I saw her face the wolves in their own den." "You were watching?" Clara asked, surprised. Two Hawks smiled, the expression transforming his stern features. "A wise man watches when his enemies gather. The Blackwoods have taken much from my people, our land, our water, our young men who tried to stand against them. Today, for the first time in many seasons, I saw them surprised. It was instructive." They resumed riding now with Two Hawks scouting ahead. As they climbed into the foothills, Carter began to speak, his voice low and measured. "Mrs. Whitmore. Clara, if I may, there are things you need to know about the Blackwoods, about me, and about what we're riding into. 15 years ago, during the war between the states, I was a Union captain stationed at Fort Collins. The Blackwoods claimed to be Union sympathizers, but they were playing both sides, selling information and supplies to whoever paid the most." Clara listened in fascination as the story unfolded. Carter's voice was steady, but she could hear the pain beneath the words. "I had a wife then, and 2 children, a boy and a girl. Sarah was everything good in the world made flesh. Michael was 8, brave as a lion and twice as stubborn. Little Emma was 5, with eyes like her mother's and a laugh that could chase away any shadow." His voice caught slightly, and Clara found herself holding her breath. The Blackwoods had arranged for Confederate raiders to attack supply convoys, making it look like random Indian raids. But they got greedy, decided to hit the officers' quarters at the fort while most of the men were away on patrol. They thought they'd find documents, maybe some gold. What they found was my family. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the steady rhythm of hoofbeats and the distant cry of a hawk. "I came back to find our home burned, my wife and children." He stopped, unable to continue. Clara felt tears burning her eyes. "I'm so sorry." The raiders were long gone, but they left behind evidence: a silver button from a Confederate uniform, but with markings that showed it was manufactured in Denver. Blackwood's tailor shop. It took me 3 years to piece together the whole conspiracy, to understand how deep the corruption went. By then the war was over, and powerful men had covered their tracks well. "Is that why there's a bounty on you?" Carter's laugh was bitter. "That's why there are several bounties on me. When legal justice fails, some men turn to other methods. I've spent the last 12 years making sure the Blackwoods pay for every life they've destroyed, every family they've shattered. It's made me unpopular with territorial authorities who prefer to maintain the status quo." They were climbing steadily now, the air growing cooler as the sun sank lower in the sky. Ahead, Clara could see a narrow valley nestled between towering peaks, green with grass and dotted with cattle. "Your ranch?" she asked. "Home," Carter confirmed, "or as close to one as I've had since the war." As they descended into the valley, Clara was struck by the ranch's layout. The main house was built like a fortress, with thick stone walls and narrow windows that would serve as gun ports if needed. Outbuildings were positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire, and she could see the gleam of metal from carefully concealed rifle positions. "You've been expecting trouble," she observed. "For 12 years, Carter replied. "The Blackwoods have tried to take this place 6 times. They're persistent, if nothing else." Several men emerged from the buildings as they approached, cowhands by their dress, but with the alert, watchful bearing of soldiers. Among them, Clara was surprised to see a black man in a captain's uniform, a grizzled mountain man who looked like he'd stepped out of a frontier legend, and a young Mexican vaquero whose hand never strayed far from his gun. "Jonas!" the uniformed man called out. "We saw the dust clouds. Trouble in town." Carter dismounted and helped Clara down, his hands gentle but impersonal. "More than usual, Captain Williams. Mrs. Whitmore, may I present Captain Joshua Williams, late of the 10th Cavalry and currently the Territorial Judge's chief investigator." Williams touched his hat brim respectfully. "Ma'am, I heard about your troubles in town. Blackwood's getting bolder." "Or more desperate," suggested the mountain man, stepping forward. "Name's Bear McKinnon, ma'am. Been fighting Blackwood since before they knew they needed fighting." The young Mexican nodded politely. "Diego Santos, señora. Your reputation has preceded you." "My reputation?" Clara asked, confused. "Word travels fast in the territory," Williams explained. "A Boston lady standing up to the Blackwoods in the middle of Cheyenne's Main Street. That's the kind of story that grows wings." 2 hawks had dismounted as well and was studying the horizon with obvious concern. "The Buffalo Soldier will not follow into the valley tonight," he announced, "but tomorrow when the sun is high they will come." Carter nodded grimly. "Then we have tonight to prepare." He turned to Clara, his pale eyes serious. "Last chance to change your mind, ma'am. Come morning, this place is going to become a battlefield." Clara looked around at the faces surrounding her, hard men, dangerous men, but also men who'd made a choice to stand against injustice even when it cost them everything. She thought of her husband, of the dreams they'd shared for their ranch, of the children they'd never had the chance to have. She thought of Colonel Blackwood's cold smile and Marcus's crude proposition. "Mr. Carter," she said firmly, "I believe I mentioned that I have nothing left to lose, but I'm beginning to think I might have something to gain after all." As the sun disappeared behind the mountain peaks and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Clara Whitmore stood in the center of a circle of men who'd sworn to bring down the most powerful family in the territory. Tomorrow would bring violence and danger beyond anything she'd ever imagined. But tonight, for the first time since Thomas died, she felt truly alive. The war was just beginning. The first gray light of dawn was creeping over the mountain peaks when Clara woke to the sound of boots on wooden floors and the low murmur of men's voices. She'd slept fitfully in the small guest room Carter had given her, her dreams filled with gunfire and Thomas's voice calling her name from somewhere she couldn't reach. Now, as consciousness returned fully, she could hear the unmistakable sounds of preparation for war. She dressed quickly in the practical riding clothes Carter had procured for her sturdy canvas pants, a cotton shirt and boots that actually fit her feet properly. Looking in the small mirror above the wash basin, she barely recognized herself. The pampered Boston lady was gone, replaced by someone harder, more angular, someone who might actually survive what was coming. Downstairs, she found the main room transformed into a military command center. Maps were spread across the dining table, weapons cleaned and arranged with military precision, and the men moved with the quiet efficiency of soldiers preparing for battle. Carter stood at the center of it all, his pale eyes studying a hand-drawn sketch of the valley approaches. "Good morning, Mrs. Whitmore," Captain Williams said, looking up from where he was checking the loads in a repeating rifle. "Sleep well?" "As well as could be expected," she replied, accepting a cup of coffee from Diego Santos. The young vaquero's face was grave, but his hands were steady as he handed her the steaming mug. "Any word from the lookouts?" Carter asked without looking up from his maps. Bear McKinnon spat into the fireplace with practiced accuracy. "Two Hawks spotted them about an hour ago, camped at Devil's Bend. Sullivan's got 12 men with him, all professionals by the look of them. They're taking their time, probably waiting for full daylight." "Smart," Carter mused. "Sullivan's many things, but he's not reckless. He knows this valley's layout, knows we have the advantage of position." Clara moved closer to the table, studying the detailed sketches. "You've mapped every approach, every one that matters," Carter confirmed. "This valley's a natural fortress, but it's also a potential trap. 3 ways in, but only 2 ways out if things go badly." Diego pointed to a narrow gap between 2 towering rock formations on the eastern side of the valley. "El Paso del Diablo, Devil's Gate. Very narrow, very dangerous, but it leads to the high country. If we must run, that is our path." "We're not running," Carter said firmly. "This ends here today, one way or another." Williams looked up from his rifle. "Jonas, be reasonable. Sullivan's got 12 men and the Blackwoods will send more when these don't come back. We could disappear into the mountains, regroup. And then what?" Carter's voice carried an edge of steel. "Live like fugitives for the rest of our lives, while the Blackwoods continue to destroy everything decent in this territory. No, today we make our stand." Clara found herself studying Carter's profile as he spoke. In the harsh morning light, she could see the lines that pain and loss had carved around his eyes, the premature silver in his hair. This man had been fighting his war for 15 years, and it had cost him everything. Yet here he stood unbowed, ready to risk what little he had left for a chance at justice. "What can I do?" she heard herself ask. All eyes turned to her, and she saw surprise on several faces. Bear McKinnon actually chuckled. "Well, I'll be damned. The lady's got sand after all." "Clara," Carter said gently, "you don't need to—" "Yes, I do," she interrupted, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. "The Blackwoods took my husband's land, tried to steal my dignity, and would have made me their chattel if you hadn't intervened. This is my fight, too." 2 Hawks who had been silent until now nodded approvingly. "The woman speaks truth. Her heart burns with the fire of justice, same as ours." Carter studied her for a long moment, those pale eyes seeming to look straight through to her soul. Finally, he nodded. "Can you shoot?" Thomas taught me, she replied. I'm not an expert, but I can hit what I aim at. That's all anyone can ask, Williams said, hefting a Winchester rifle. This is a good weapon, accurate, reliable. 15 rounds without reloading. Clara took the rifle, feeling its weight in her hands. It was heavier than the small pistol Thomas had taught her to use, but the balance felt right. She worked the lever action once, checking the mechanism. The safety's here, Diego explained, showing her the small switch. And remember, Senora, aim for the center of the body. A wounded enemy is often more dangerous than a dead one. The casual way he spoke of killing made Clara's stomach tighten, but she forced herself to nod. This was the reality now, not the civilized drawing rooms of Boston, but the harsh arithmetic of survival on the frontier. A low whistle from outside made everyone freeze. 2 hawks moved to the window, peering through a gap in the heavy curtains. They come, he announced quietly. Sullivan leads them, the black-hearted one's sons ride beside him. Carter moved to another window, his own rifle appearing in his hands as if by magic. Clara saw him sight down the barrel, tracking movement she couldn't yet see. 12 men, just as Bear said. They're staying together, moving cautious-like up the main trail. He paused, studying their approach. Sullivan's smart. He's not going to charge into a prepared position. He'll try to talk first, see if he can draw us out. And if talking doesn't work, Clara asked, though she already knew the answer. Then men die, Carter replied simply. The next few minutes passed in tense silence as Sullivan's party approached the ranch buildings. Clara found herself pressed against the wall beside a window, heart hammering so hard she was sure the others could hear it. Through the narrow gap in the curtains, she caught her first clear look at the infamous bounty hunter. Sullivan was even more imposing up close than he'd been in the town square. Sitting his horse with casual confidence, he surveyed the ranch buildings with the eye of a professional killer. His massive frame dwarfed his mount, and the twin colts at his hips seemed like natural extensions of his body. Beside him rode Marcus and Noah Blackwood, though the 2 brothers couldn't have looked more different. Marcus sat straight and arrogant, his hand resting on his gun butt, clearly eager for violence. Noah, however, seemed uncomfortable, his eyes darting nervously between the buildings as if expecting death to emerge from every shadow. Jonas Carter, Sullivan's voice boomed across the valley, echoing off the surrounding cliffs. We need to talk. Carter moved to the front door, though he stayed well back from the opening. I'm listening, Sullivan. Say your piece. The lady's got debts to pay. Send her out, and nobody else needs to get hurt. Clara felt anger flare in her chest. Even now, even here, they thought they could reduce her to a piece of property to be traded back and forth. The lady's under my protection, Carter called back. She's not going anywhere. There was a pause, then Marcus Blackwood's voice sharp with arrogance. Carter, you're harboring a criminal. Surrender her now, and we might let you live. Bear McKinnon spat again. His weathered face twisted with disgust. Might let us live. Generous of them. 2 hawks had moved to a position near the back of the house, his bow strung and ready. Clara noticed he'd painted his face with war colors, stark black and white stripes that made his features look like a death mask. Your move, Carter, Sullivan called. We can do this easy or hard. Carter looked around at his companions, reading the determination in each face. When his eyes met Clara's, she saw him searching for any sign of doubt or fear. She lifted her chin and tightened her grip on the Winchester. Hard it is, then, Carter shouted back. The words had barely left his mouth when all hell broke loose. Sullivan's men had positioned themselves while their leader talked, spreading out in a rough semicircle around the ranch buildings. At some unseen signal, they opened fire, simultaneously filling the air with the thunder of gunshots and the whine of bullets striking wood and stone. Clara threw herself to the floor as the window above her exploded in a shower of glass. The noise was overwhelming, not just the gunfire, but the sound of splintering wood, the screaming of horses, and the shouted orders of men trying to coordinate their attack. Stay low! Carter yelled, though she could barely hear him over the din. He was at the front window now, his rifle speaking with methodical precision. She saw him work the lever sight fire, work the lever again, each movement smooth and practiced. Williams had taken position at the side window, his repeating rifle adding its voice to the chaos. Got one! He called out as a figure tumbled from his saddle. From the back of the house came the distinctive twang of 2 hawks' bow, followed immediately by a scream of pain. The Cheyenne warrior was a ghost appearing at one window to loose an arrow, then melting away to emerge somewhere else. Bear McKinnon had climbed to the loft where he commanded a view of the entire valley through a specially constructed shooting port. His buffalo rifle boomed like thunder, and Clara saw another of Sullivan's men go down. "They're trying to flank us," Diego called from the kitchen where he was watching the eastern approach. 3 men moving toward the barn. "Let them come," Carter replied grimly. "Bear, can you discourage them?" The mountain man's rifle boomed again, and one of the flanking figures stumbled and fell. The other 2 dove for cover behind a watering trough. Clara forced herself to crawl to the window, trying to find a target. Through the smoke and chaos, she could see Sullivan himself, still mounted, directing his men's movements with hand signals. Marcus Blackwood was beside him, his fancy rifle speaking with sharp cracks. She raised her Winchester sighted carefully on Marcus and squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, and she saw Marcus's hat fly off his head. He spun in his saddle looking for the source of the shot, his face a mask of rage. "Good shooting," Carter called approvingly. "Keep them honest." The battle settled into a deadly rhythm. Sullivan's men would advance seeking better positions, and the defenders would drive them back with accurate fire. Bodies began to accumulate in the yard, some moving, some ominously still. But Clara could see that time was not on their side. Sullivan had more men, more ammunition, and the patience to wait for the defenders to make a mistake. Worse, she'd noticed Noah Blackwood studying the ranch's layout with calculating eyes, as if looking for weaknesses in their defenses. "Jonas," Williams called from his position. "They're massing for a rush southeast corner." Carter appeared at Clara's side, his face grim. "When they charge, they'll try to overwhelm one position with numbers. When that happens, we fall back to the next line of defense." "Next line?" Clara asked, confused. Carter's smile was wolf-like. "Did you think this was all we had prepared?" Before he could explain further, Sullivan's voice boomed across the valley again. "Carter, you're only delaying the inevitable. Send out the woman and the rest of you can ride away." "Go to hell, Sullivan," Carter shouted back. The bounty hunter's laughter was like the rumble of distant thunder. "Already been there, Carter. Didn't much care for the company." Noah Blackwood had dismounted and was moving closer to the house using the bodies of the fallen as cover. Clara could see him clearly now, young, maybe 25, with his father's strong jaw, but eyes that held doubt rather than cruelty. She sighted on him, then hesitated. Something in his posture, the way he moved, suggested he wasn't entirely committed to this attack. As she watched, he reached a position near the front porch, but made no move to advance further. "Señora," Diego's urgent voice cut through her thoughts. "They come from the east." Clara spun to see 3 of Sullivan's men charging toward the house, their rifles firing from the hip. 2 hawks materialized like smoke, his bow singing. One attacker went down with an arrow through his chest, but the other 2 kept coming. Williams appeared in the kitchen doorway, his rifle speaking rapidly. The second attacker stumbled and fell, but the third made it to the house, throwing himself against the back door with bone-jarring force. The door reinforced with iron bands held, but Clara could hear him working at the latch. Diego appeared beside the door, his pistol ready. "Ándale, pendejo," the vaquero called mockingly. "Come inside and die." Instead of breaking down the door, the attacker did something unexpected, began to retreat, calling out to his companions. Clara heard Sullivan's voice answering and realized the attack had been a probe, a test of their defenses. "They're learning our positions," Carter observed grimly. "Next time they'll coordinate better." As if summoned by his words, the tempo of the battle suddenly changed. Instead of the sporadic firing they'd been enduring, Sullivan's remaining men opened up with everything they had, pouring bullets into the ranch house with devastating intensity. The noise was incredible, like being inside a thunderstorm. Wood splintered, windows shattered, and the air filled with flying debris. Clara pressed herself against the floor, feeling the vibration of bullets striking the walls around her. Through the chaos, she heard Carter's voice, calm and steady. "This is it. They're covering another charge. Everyone watch your sectors." "Bear." McKinnon's buffalo rifle roared from the loft, and she heard him curse colorfully. "Miss the bastard, Sullivan's moving." Clara forced herself to look out the window again. Through the smoke and flying lead, she could see the massive bounty hunter spurring his horse forward, his twin colts blazing. Behind him came Marcus Blackwood and 3 more men charging straight at the front of the house. Carter appeared at the window beside her, his rifle working with mechanical precision. One of the charging men went down, then another, but Sullivan kept coming, his face a mask of professional concentration. The bounty hunter's horse stumbled as Two Hawk's arrow found its mark, but Sullivan rolled clear as the animal fell, coming up with both guns firing. His shots were devastatingly accurate. Clara heard Williams cry out from the kitchen and saw splinters explode from the wall inches from Carter's head. Marcus Blackwood had made it to the porch and was firing through the shattered front window. His bullets forced Carter and Clara back from their position, giving Sullivan time to reach the house. "Back!" Carter shouted. "Fall back to the second line." Clara found herself being pulled toward the rear of the house as the front began to collapse under the assault. Through the smoke and chaos, she could see Sullivan's massive frame outlined in the doorway, his guns searching for targets. But as they retreated, something unexpected happened. Instead of pressing his advantage, Sullivan suddenly spun toward the front porch, his weapons trained on something outside. "What the hell are you doing, boy?" the bounty hunter roared. Clara couldn't see what had caught his attention, but she heard a young voice answer, Noah Blackwood, his words carrying clearly through the gunfire. "This is wrong, Sullivan. The woman's done nothing to deserve this." "Get back in position," Marcus Blackwood snarled at his brother. "Father's orders. Father's not here." Noah shot back. "And I'm done taking orders that make me sick to my stomach." The gunfire had slackened as Sullivan's men tried to understand what was happening. Clara saw Carter motion for the others to hold their fire, his pale eyes fixed on the drama unfolding outside. "Boy, you're making a big mistake," Sullivan said, his voice carrying a note of warning. "Maybe," Noah replied, "but it's my mistake to make." The sound of a single gunshot echoed across the valley, sharp and final. Clara held her breath, waiting to see who had fallen. It was Sullivan, who staggered, his left arm hanging useless at his side, blood spreading across his shirt. Noah Blackwood stood 10 feet away, a smoking pistol in his hand, his face pale but determined. "You little bastard!" Marcus screamed at his brother, raising his own weapon. But before he could fire, Two Hawks appeared on the roof like an avenging spirit, his bow drawn. The arrow took Marcus through the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his shot wild. The remaining attackers, seeing their leaders down and confused, began to fall back. Sullivan, despite his wound, was trying to rally them, but the fight had gone out of most of them. Carter stepped onto the porch, his rifle ready but not immediately threatening. "It's over, Sullivan. Your men are dead or running, and you're bleeding like a stuck pig. Call it quits." The bounty hunter looked around at the carnage in the yard, then at Noah Blackwood, who still held his smoking gun. His face was a mixture of pain and something that might have been respect. "Didn't figure on family turning on family," he admitted. "Changes the odds considerable." "It changes everything," Noah said quietly. "Mrs. Whitmore, I apologize for my family's actions. What we tried to do here today was wrong." Clara stepped forward, still holding her rifle but no longer aiming it at anyone. "Why?" she asked simply. "Why turn against your own blood?" Noah's laugh was bitter. "Blood doesn't give you the right to destroy innocent people. I've watched my father and brother ruin lives for 15 years, always telling myself it was just business, just the way things worked out here. But today, seeing you stand up to them in town, watching you face down armed men rather than submit to being their property, I couldn't be part of it anymore." Sullivan was leaning against the porch rail now, his face gray with blood loss. "Touching?" he said sarcastically. "But the colonel's not going to see it that way. You just signed your own death warrant, boy." "Maybe," Noah agreed, "but at least I'll die with a clean conscience." Williams emerged from the house, a bloody bandage around his left arm, but otherwise intact. "We need to get Sullivan to a doctor before he bleeds out." "Why?" Bear McKinnon asked, climbing down from the loft. "Save us the trouble of burying him." "Because," Carter said firmly, "we're not murderers. We're trying to bring justice to this territory, not chaos." As if summoned by the word justice, the sound of hoofbeats echoed from the valley entrance. Everyone tensed, weapons rising, until Two Hawks called out from his perch. "Riders approach, but they carry the flag of the territorial government." Clara felt a surge of hope as she saw the small column of blue-uniformed cavalry riding into the valley, led by a figure in civilian clothes. Behind them came a wagon that could only belong to the territorial marshal. "Judge Williams," Captain Williams called out, recognizing the lead rider. "About time you got here." The elderly judge dismounted stiffly, his keen eyes taking in the scene of battle. "I came as soon as I received Captain Williams's message. It appears I arrived just in time to prevent a massacre." Carter stepped forward, his rifle lowered but ready. "Judge, I want you to witness what happened here today. Sullivan and a dozen men attacked my property without legal warrant, trying to seize Mrs. Whitmore on trumped-up charges." "I can see that," Judge Williams replied dryly, looking at the bodies scattered around the yard. "But what I find more interesting is young Mr. Blackwood here, standing with you rather than against you." Noah straightened his shoulders, meeting the judge's gaze directly. "Your Honor, I have testimony to give about my family's business practices, evidence of fraud, intimidation, and worse." Sullivan tried to speak, but a coughing fit brought up blood and he sagged against the porch rail. The territorial marshal, a grizzled man named Henderson, was already directing his men to secure the scene and tend to the wounded. "Marshal," Carter called, "you'll want to send word to Colonel Blackwood that his son has some interesting things to tell us about the family business." Henderson nodded grimly. "I'll send a rider, but something tells me the colonel's not going to come quietly." As if in response to his words, the sound of distant gunfire echoed from the direction of Cheyenne. Everyone froze, listening to the sporadic popping of rifles and the occasional boom of something heavier. "What the hell?" Bear McKinnon muttered. Two Hawks was already climbing higher, seeking a better vantage point. After a few moments, he called down, "Smoke rises from the town, much smoke." Judge Williams' face had gone pale. Colonel Blackwood wouldn't be fool enough to attack Cheyenne directly, would he? "He would if he thought he was about to lose everything," Noah said quietly. "Father doesn't accept defeat gracefully. If he's realized what's happening here, if he knows I've turned against him—" He paused, his face stricken. "He'll burn the whole territory before he lets anyone else have it." Clara felt her heart sink. They'd won the battle here at the ranch, but the war was far from over. In fact, if Noah was right, it was about to get much worse. "How many men does your father have at his disposal?" Judge Williams asked urgently. 50, maybe 60 fighting men," Noah replied, "plus whatever hired guns he can scrape together on short notice. And he has friends in the territorial government, men who owe him favors." The sound of gunfire from Cheyenne was growing more intense, and the smoke plume was clearly visible now, rising like a black banner against the clear morning sky. Carter was already moving toward his horse. "Judge, I respectfully request that you take Mrs. Whitmore into protective custody. What's coming next is going to be ugly, and she's been through enough." "Like hell," Clara said firmly, surprising everyone, including herself. "I started this fight yesterday in that town square, and I'm going to see it through to the end." "Clara," Carter said gently, "this isn't your war anymore. We have Noah's testimony evidence of the Blackwoods' crimes. The law can handle it from here." "The law," she laughed, but there was no humor in it. "The same law that stood by and watched while they tried to steal my land and make me their property. The same law that's let them terrorize this territory for 15 years. She shook her head. "No, Mr. Carter. I trusted the law once and it failed me. This time I'm trusting the only thing that's worked so far, good people with guns standing up to evil people with money." Two Hawks dropped down from his perch, his face grim. "The woman speaks wisdom. The law is like rain, sometimes it falls where it's needed, sometimes it does not. But a warrior's courage never fails." Judge Williams looked troubled. "Mrs. Whitmore, I understand your feelings, but what you're suggesting is vigilante justice. Once we abandon the rule of law, where does it end?" "It ends," Carter said quietly, "when good people no longer have to beg others not to look at them while they're being destroyed." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Clara felt something shift inside her chest, a hardening of resolve that went deeper than anger or fear. For the first time since Thomas died, she knew exactly who she was and what she had to do. "Judge," she said formally, "I appreciate your concern for my safety, but I'm a grown woman and I have the right to choose my own path. My path leads to Cheyenne to face whatever Colonel Blackwood has planned." The elderly judge studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Very well, but you'll go with a federal escort and under the protection of territorial law. Marshal Henderson, prepare your men to move out." As the small army prepared to ride toward the smoke rising from Cheyenne, Clara found herself standing beside Noah Blackwood. The young man was staring at the distant smoke with haunted eyes. "I did this," he said quietly. "If I hadn't turned against him, if I'd just kept my mouth shut, then innocent people would have continued to suffer." Clara replied firmly. "You made the right choice, Mr. Blackwood. Whatever comes next, you can live with yourself. Noah looked at her with something like wonder. How do you do it? How do you stay so strong? Clara thought of Thomas, of their dreams for the ranch, of the children they'd never had. She thought of yesterday's humiliation in the town square and of this morning's battle. She thought of all the women who'd faced similar choices and made similar stands. I don't know if I'm strong, she said honestly, but I know I'm done being afraid. As they mounted up for the ride to Cheyenne, Carter appeared at her side. In the growing light, she could see new lines of exhaustion around his eyes, but also something else, a spark of hope that hadn't been there before. Ready for this? He asked quietly. Clara looked toward the smoke rising from the town, toward whatever waited for them there. She thought of the woman who'd stood in the town square yesterday begging people not to look at her shame. That woman was gone, burned away in the crucible of violence and choice. I'm ready, she said, and meant it. Behind them, Sullivan was being loaded into a wagon, conscious but pale. His eyes met Clara's as she rode past, and she saw something like respect in his gaze. You're not what I expected, lady, he called out weakly. Neither are you, she replied, and realized it was true. The column moved out, riding hard toward whatever Colonel Blackwood had planned for them in Cheyenne. But for the first time since this all began, Clara felt like they had a real chance of winning. The war was far from over, but the balance had shifted, and sometimes that was enough. The smoke rising from Cheyenne grew thicker as they rode hard down the mountain trail, and Clara could taste ash on the wind long before they reached the valley floor. What had started as a thin gray plume was now a towering black column that stained the morning sky like spilled ink. The sound of gunfire, which had been sporadic and distant when they left Carter's ranch, now came in sustained volleys that echoed off the surrounding hills like thunder. Jesus Christ, Marshal Henderson muttered, standing in his stirrups for a better view. The whole damn town's under siege. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs as they crested the final ridge overlooking Cheyenne. The sight below made her stomach clench with horror. Buildings along Main Street were ablaze, their flames reaching toward the sky like desperate fingers. In the street itself, she could see the dark shapes of bodies scattered like broken dolls. But worse than the destruction was the systematic nature of it. This wasn't random violence, but a carefully orchestrated campaign of terror. Colonel Blackwood's not just fighting, Noah said, his voice hollow with shock. He's making an example, showing the whole territory what happens to anyone who stands against him. Carter spurred his horse closer to the ridgeline, his pale eyes scanning the chaos below with the practiced gaze of a soldier. There, he pointed toward the center of town. Blackwood's men have taken the bank and the hotel. They're using them as strong points, controlling the main intersection. Judge Williams pulled out a pair of field glasses, studying the scene with growing dismay. I count at least 40 men down there, maybe more. They've got the townspeople pinned down in their buildings, too scared to move. Where's Sheriff Mason? Marshal Henderson asked, searching for any sign of local law enforcement. There, Two Hawks said grimly, pointing toward the jail. A body and a star-shaped badge lay motionless on the steps, and the building itself showed signs of having been ransacked. Clara felt bile rise in her throat. Yesterday morning, Sheriff Mason had been a living, breathing man with a family and hopes for the future. Now he was just another casualty in the Blackwoods' war against anyone who dared oppose them. We can't just charge in there. Captain Williams observed his military training, evident in how he assessed the tactical situation. They've got the high ground, prepared positions, and local knowledge. It would be suicide. Then what do you suggest? Clara asked, struggling to keep her voice steady. That we just sit here and watch while they burn the town. We need a plan, Carter said firmly. Something that uses our advantages against their weaknesses. What advantages? Noah asked bitterly. They outnumber us, they know the terrain, and they don't care about civilian casualties. They don't know we're here yet, Two Hawks pointed out, and they don't know you've turned against them. That gives us the element of surprise. Carter was studying the town layout with the intensity of a chess master planning his next move. The Blackwoods are creatures of habit. Colonel Blackwood will have set up his command post somewhere he feels secure, somewhere that reflects his sense of superiority. The Cattlemen's Club, Noah said immediately. It's where he holds court, where all the important decisions get made. If he's down there, that's where he'll be. Clara could see the building Noah indicated, a two-story brick structure at the end of Main Street, its windows commanding a clear view of the entire downtown area. Even from this distance, she could see the glint of rifle barrels protruding from those windows. "How many ways in and out?" Carter asked. "Front entrance, back door through the kitchen, and a service entrance on the east side," Noah replied, "but he'll have them all covered." "What about the roof?" Noah frowned, thinking. "There's a ladder on the back wall for chimney cleaning, but it's exposed. Anyone climbing it would be visible from half the town." "Bleh." "Not if they had a distraction," Bear McKinnon suggested, speaking up for the first time since they'd left the ranch. The grizzled mountain man had been unusually quiet during the ride, but now his weathered face showed the calculating look of a man who'd survived more battles than most. "What kind of distraction?" Judge Williams asked. Bear's grin was wolfish. "The kind that makes a lot of noise and draws attention away from where it shouldn't be." As they discussed tactics, Clara found herself studying the devastation below with growing anger. These weren't soldiers or criminals being killed down there. They were shopkeepers and farmers, mothers and children. People whose only crime had been living in a town where the Blackwoods felt threatened. "There," she said suddenly, pointing toward a cluster of buildings on the outskirts of town. "The church. People will have taken shelter there. If we can get them out." "It would be the right thing to do," Carter agreed, "but it would also alert the Blackwoods to our presence." "Then we make our presence known on our terms, not theirs," Clara said firmly. "We save who we can and we make sure everyone knows we're here to fight." Marshal Henderson was nodding approvingly. "I like it. We split into 3 groups, one to evacuate civilians, one to create the distraction Bear mentioned, and one to go after Colonel Blackwood directly." "I'm going after my father," Noah said quietly. "This started with family, and it needs to end with family." "Like hell," Carter replied. "You're brave, kid, but you're not a killer. Going up against your father and Marcus, that's a different kind of fight than what happened at the ranch." "Maybe," Noah admitted, "but I know them better than anyone else here. I know how they think, how they'll react. You need that knowledge." Clara saw the truth in the young man's words, even as part of her recoiled from the idea of asking him to face his own blood in mortal combat. But war, she was learning, demanded terrible choices from good people. "We do this together," she said firmly. "All of us. Nobody goes in alone." Two Hawks had been silent during their planning, but now he spoke up. "The Cheyenne have a saying, 'The wolf that hunts alone feeds the vultures.' Today, we hunt as a pack." The next few minutes were spent in rapid preparation. Weapons were checked, ammunition distributed, and final plans confirmed. Clara found herself paired with Carter and Noah for the assault on the Cattlemen's Club, while Two Hawks and Bear would create their distraction by hitting the Blackwood positions at the bank. Judge Williams, Marshal Henderson, and Captain Williams would coordinate the civilian evacuation and provide support where needed. As they prepared to descend into the valley, Carter pulled Clara aside. "Last chance to reconsider," he said quietly. "What we're about to do, there's no going back from it. If we succeed, you'll have helped kill men. If we fail, you'll be dead. Either way, the woman who rode out of Boston to marry a rancher will be gone forever." Clara looked down at the burning town, at the bodies in the street, at the smoke rising like an accusation against the clear Wyoming sky. She thought of Thomas, of the dreams they'd shared, of the life they'd planned to build in this harsh but beautiful land. "That woman died yesterday in the town square," she said simply. "The woman standing here now has work to finish." Carter studied her face for a long moment, then nodded. "Then let's finish it." They moved down the mountainside like shadows, using every fold in the terrain to remain hidden from the Blackwood sentries. The closer they got to town, the more apparent the systematic nature of the destruction became. This wasn't random violence. It was a message written in fire and blood intended to cow anyone who might consider standing against the Blackwood Empire. 2 blocks from the main battle, they separated. Clara watched Two Hawks and Bear McKinnon melt away toward the bank like ghosts, their movements so quiet she lost sight of them within moments. Then she was following Carter and Noah through the maze of back alleys and abandoned buildings that would bring them to the rear of the Cattlemen's Club. The sound of gunfire was constant now, punctuated by the crash of falling timber and the occasional scream. Clara tried not to think about the human cost of each sound, focusing instead on the weight of the Winchester in her hands and the steady rhythm of Carter's movement ahead of her. They reached the alley behind the Cattlemen's Club without being detected, and Carter motioned for them to take cover behind a horse trough while he studied their target. The building loomed above them, its brick walls scarred by bullet holes but still solid and imposing. "2 guards at the back door," Carter whispered. "Another one at the service entrance. They're alert but not expecting trouble from this direction." "The ladder to the roof," Noah asked. "Exposed just like you said, but if Bear's distraction works." As if summoned by his words, a tremendous explosion shook the ground beneath their feet. Clara felt the concussion wave pass through her body and saw windows rattle in their frames throughout the block. In the distance, a column of flame shot skyward from the direction of the bank. "What the hell was that?" one of the guards at the back door called out. "Sounded like the ammunition depot went up," his companion replied. "Jesus, look at that fire." Both men were staring toward the explosion, their attention completely focused on the distant flames. Carter was already moving his knife, appearing in his hand like magic. Clara had to look away as he dealt with the guards, some things she realized were beyond her experience no matter how much she'd changed. "Service entrance," Carter whispered, and they slipped through the side door into the building's kitchen. The interior of the Cattleman's Club reeked of cigar smoke and fear sweat. Clara could hear voices from the main room, Colonel Blackwood's commanding bass, Marcus's sharp tenor, and several others she didn't recognize. They were discussing something in urgent, angry tones. "Told you the boy was weak," Marcus was saying. "Should have dealt with him years ago." "Noah is still my son," Colonel Blackwood replied, though his voice carried more anger than paternal affection. "When this is over, I'll decide his fate personally." "If there is an after," came a new voice, older, more cultured. "This campaign of yours has attracted federal attention. Judge Williams has already sent word to the territorial governor." "The governor owes me more favors than he can count," Blackwood replied dismissively, "and Judge Williams won't be a problem much longer." Clara felt her blood run cold. These men were discussing murder as casually as they might debate the weather. Carter motioned for them to move closer to the main room. Through a crack in the kitchen door, Clara could see the colonel standing at the front window, his imposing figure silhouetted against the burning town beyond. Marcus was pacing like a caged animal, his hand never straying far from his gun. Several other men, hired guns by their look, were positioned around the room. "Sir," one of the gunmen called from the front window, "something's happening at the bank. Looks like it's on fire." Colonel Blackwood moved to the window, his face darkening as he saw the flames. "Send a squad to investigate and double the guards on all approaches." "Already done, sir, but we're running low on men. This siege is costing us more than we anticipated." "Then we finish it quickly," Blackwood snarled. "Burn out the last holdouts, execute anyone who's given aid to our enemies, and send a message that will be remembered for generations." Clara saw Carter's jaw tighten at the casual discussion of mass murder. Beside her, Noah was pale but determined, his young face aged by the terrible knowledge of what his family had become. Another explosion, smaller than the first but still substantial, shook the building. This time it came from a different direction, the hotel, Clara thought. "Bear's keeping them busy," Carter whispered approvingly. "Time to make our move." But before they could act, the front door of the club burst open and Two Hawks entered like an avenging spirit. His war paint made him look like death incarnate, and the tomahawk in his hand gleamed with fresh blood. "Colonel Blackwood," the Cheyenne warrior called out, his accented English carrying clearly through the sudden silence, "I have come to collect a debt owed in blood." Every gun in the room swung toward Two Hawks, but the warrior was already moving his tomahawk, taking down the nearest gunman even as bullets filled the air around him. Clara saw him stumble as a shot found its mark, but he kept fighting with the ferocity of a cornered wolf. Carter was through the kitchen door in an instant, his rifle speaking with deadly precision. Clara followed her own Winchester, adding its voice to the chaos. The advantage of surprise was theirs, but only for moments. Noah appeared beside her, his face a mask of grim determination as he faced the men who'd been his allies just hours before. "Marcus," he called to his brother, "it doesn't have to end this way." Marcus Blackwood spun toward his younger brother, his face twisted with rage and betrayal. "You treacherous little bastard, father should have drowned you at birth." "Maybe," Noah agreed sadly. "But he didn't, and now we're here." The two brothers faced each other across the smoke-filled room, their family's love and hatred distilled into this single moment of truth. Clara could see the pain in Noah's eyes, but also an unshakable resolve. "Stand down, Marcus," Noah said quietly. "Order the men to cease fire. Let's end this before more people die." "End this." Marcus laughed, but there was hysteria in the sound. You've destroyed everything we built, everything Father worked for. You think I'm going to just surrender because my little brother got religion? I think you're going to surrender because it's the right thing to do, Noah replied. Because somewhere under all that hate and greed, there's still the brother who used to read me bedtime stories. For a moment, Clara thought she saw something flicker in Marcus's eyes, doubt perhaps, or the ghost of the boy he'd once been. But then Colonel Blackwood's voice cut through the moment like a blade. "Kill them all," he commanded coldly. "Start with the traitor." Marcus's hesitation vanished, replaced by the blind obedience that had defined his relationship with his father. His gun came up, aimed directly at Noah's chest. Clara moved without thinking, her Winchester barking as she sent a bullet into Marcus's shoulder. The impact spun him around his shot, going wide, and Noah threw himself sideways behind an overturned table. The room exploded into violence. Colonel Blackwood had produced a shotgun from somewhere and was firing into the melee with devastating effect. Two Hawks, wounded but still fighting, had taken cover behind the bar and was picking off targets with his remaining arrows. Carter was a blur of motion, his rifle empty now, but his pistol speaking with measured precision. Through the chaos, Clara found herself face to face with Colonel Blackwood himself. The man who'd started this war, who'd destroyed her husband's legacy and tried to reduce her to property, stood before her with murder in his eyes. "Oh," he said, his voice carrying over the gunfire with aristocratic disdain. "The little widow thinks she can play with the big boys." "I'm not playing," Clara replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "And I'm not that frightened woman from yesterday." Blackwood's smile was cold as winter. "No, you're the woman who's about to die for her foolish pride." His shotgun swung toward her, but before he could fire, Noah appeared between them. The young man had blood running down his face from a graze, but his pistol was steady as he aimed it at his father's chest. "Let her go, Father," he said quietly. "This is between us now." Colonel Blackwood's face went through a series of emotions, surprise, rage, and finally, something that might have been grief. "My own son," he whispered. "My own blood turned against me." "You turned me against you," Noah replied sadly. "Years of watching you destroy innocent people, years of telling myself it was just business. But it was never just business, was it? It was always about the power, about making people kneel." "I built an empire," Blackwood roared. "I carved civilization out of wilderness. I gave you everything." "You gave me nothing but shame," Noah said, "and I won't carry it anymore." Father and son faced each other across a distance that was measured in more than feet. 15 years of family loyalty and bitter disappointment of love corrupted by greed and power, all balanced on the edge of a trigger pull. Clara held her breath, waiting to see which would prove stronger, blood or conscience. The decision was made for them. Marcus, wounded but not defeated, had worked his way around the room and now appeared behind Noah with a knife in his good hand. Clara saw the blade rise, saw the savage satisfaction on Marcus's face as he prepared to strike down his own brother. Her Winchester spoke once more, and Marcus collapsed to the floor, the knife clattering away across the wooden planks. Noah spun at the sound, his face going white as he saw his elder brother's still form. "Marcus!" he cried, dropping to his knees beside the fallen man. Colonel Blackwood used his son's distraction to make his move, but Carter was ready for him. The two men collided in the center of the room, fighting for control of the shotgun with desperate intensity. They were well matched. Blackwood was heavier and stronger, but Carter had the advantage of desperation and righteous fury. The shotgun discharged into the ceiling, bringing down a shower of plaster and splintered wood. Both men went down in a tangle of limbs rolling across the floor as they fought for advantage. Clara tried to get a clear shot, but the two men were too close together, moving too fast. Around the room, the last of the Blackwood gunmen were falling to two Hawks' arrows and the accurate fire of the federal marshals who'd finally fought their way into the building. Carter managed to get on top of Blackwood, his hands locked around the colonel's throat, but the older man was far from finished. His knee came up, catching Carter in the ribs and rolling him away. Both men came to their feet at the same time, circling each other like gladiators in the arena. 15 years, Blackwood panted, blood running from his nose. 15 years you've been a thorn in my side. Should have had you killed when you first showed up. Should have, Carter agreed, but you always were too arrogant for your own good. They closed again, this time with bare hands. Blackwood was a powerful man, but the years had slowed him while Carter fought with the lean efficiency of a predator. Blow traded for blow, each man trying to find the advantage that would end the fight. It was two hawks who provided the distraction that tipped the balance. The wounded warrior appeared at the window, his bow drawn despite the blood streaming down his arm. "Colonel," he called out. "Remember the family you destroyed at Sand Creek? Remember the children you murdered for their land?" Blackwood's head turned toward the voice, and in that moment of inattention, Carter struck. His fist caught the colonel on the point of the jaw, and the older man went down like a felled tree. Sudden silence fell over the room, broken only by the crackle of flames from outside and the labored breathing of the survivors. Clara looked around at the carnage, feeling numb with shock and exhaustion. Marcus Blackwood lay still on the floor, whether dead or unconscious, she couldn't tell. Colonel Blackwood was breathing, but clearly unconscious. Noah knelt between them, his face a mask of grief for the family that had destroyed itself through greed and hatred. "Is it over?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Carter, nursing his bruised ribs, looked toward the window where the fire still burned. "This part is. But there's still cleanup to do, people to help, justice to see served." Judge Williams appeared in the doorway, his face grim but satisfied. "The federal marshals have secured the town. Most of Blackwood's men are dead or captured. Those who are still alive will face trial for their crimes." Two hawks slumped against the wall, finally allowing his exhaustion to show. "It is finished," he said simply. "The debt is paid." Clara walked to the window and looked out at the town they'd fought to save. The fires were still burning, but she could see people emerging from their hiding places, federal marshals moving through the streets to restore order. Children who'd been cowering in basements were running into the sunlight, and women were embracing husbands they'd thought were dead. "What happens now?" Noah asked, still kneeling beside his fallen brothers. "Now you testify," Judge Williams said firmly. "You help us clean up the mess your family made, and you try to build something better from the ruins. And them," Noah gestured toward his father and brother, "they'll face trial assuming they survive their wounds. The law will decide their fate." Clara felt a hand on her shoulder and turned to find Carter beside her. His pale eyes were softer now, the winter ice replaced by something warmer. "You did well," he said quietly. "Better than well. You saved Noah's life, probably saved us all." "I just did what needed doing," she replied. "Same as everyone else." "No," he said firmly. "What you did was choose to become someone new, someone stronger. Not everyone has that kind of courage." Through the window, Clara could see the sun beginning to set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. The fires were dying down, and the sounds of reconstruction were already beginning. Hammers on wood, voices calling out to organize relief efforts, the everyday heroism of people rebuilding their lives. "Mr. Carter," she said formally, "you mentioned once that you had dreams of a valley, a place to call home. Is that offer still open?" His smile was the first genuinely happy expression she'd seen from him since they'd met. "For you, Mrs. Whitmore, that offer will always be open." As they stood together in the ruins of the Cattlemen's Club, surrounded by the evidence of their victory, Clara felt something she hadn't experienced since Thomas died, hope for the future. Not just her future, but the future of everyone who'd stood up to the Blackwoods, everyone who'd chosen justice over safety. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new choices to make, and battles to fight. But tonight they'd proven that ordinary people could stand against evil, and when that courage was contagious, and that sometimes the right thing and the necessary thing were exactly the same. The war was ending, but their real lives were just beginning. The dawn that followed the battle brought with it the bitter taste of smoke and the even more bitter taste of unfinished business. Clara stood on the steps of the territorial courthouse watching as federal marshals loaded the surviving Blackwood gunmen into prison wagons. The manacles around their wrists caught the early morning light, but there was no satisfaction in the sight, only the grim knowledge that justice delayed was justice denied to all those who'd suffered under the Blackwood reign. "Mrs. Whitmore," came a familiar voice behind her, and she turned to see Judge Williams approaching with a thick folder of documents under his arm. His face bore the exhaustion of a man who'd spent the night sorting through 15 years of accumulated evidence and testimony. "Judge," she acknowledged, noting the way his hands trembled slightly as he handled the papers. The events of yesterday had aged him visibly, adding new lines around his eyes and a stoop to his shoulders that hadn't been there before. "I wanted to speak with you before the formal proceedings begin." he said, his voice carrying the weight of official authority mixed with personal concern. What young Noah Blackwood has given us, it's enough to hang both his father and brother 3 times over. But it's also enough to destroy half the territorial government. Clara felt her stomach tighten. What do you mean? Judge Williams opened the folder revealing page after page of contracts correspondence and financial records. The Blackwood Cattle Company wasn't just a ranch operation, it was the center of a web of corruption that reaches into every level of government. Territorial legislators, federal appointees, even some military commanders. They all took Blackwood money in exchange for favorable decisions. She studied the papers with growing horror, recognizing some of the names from her brief time in Wyoming society. Men she'd met at church socials and community gatherings, men who'd expressed sympathy for her loss while secretly profiting from the very system that had destroyed her husband. How many people knew? She asked quietly. More than we can prosecute, fewer than we'd like to believe, Williams replied grimly. The question now is whether we expose the entire conspiracy and risk destroying faith in territorial government, or whether we focus on the worst offenders and let the smaller fish swim away. Before Clara could respond, she heard the sound of heavy footsteps on the courthouse steps. Turning, she saw Carter ascending toward them, his face bearing fresh cuts from yesterday's fighting, but his eyes clear and determined. Behind him came Two Hawks, his arm in a sling, but his bearing still proud, and Bear McKinnon, whose grizzled features showed the satisfaction of a man who'd finally seen justice done. Judge Kit, Carter said formally, I trust you've had time to review young Blackwood's testimony. I have, Williams confirmed, and I've been discussing with Mrs. Whitmore the complications it presents. Carter's pale eyes moved to Clara, reading her expression with the ease of a man who'd learned to survive by understanding people quickly. Political complications, I assume. Too many important people with dirty hands. Something like that, Williams admitted. The question is whether we pursue justice or stability. That's not a question at all, Clara said firmly, surprising all of them with the steel in her voice. Justice isn't negotiable. If powerful people have broken the law, they face the consequences. If that destabilizes the territorial government, then maybe the territorial government needs to be destabilized. Two Hawks nodded approvingly. The woman speaks wisdom. A tree that is rotten at the roots cannot bear good fruit. Easy words, Williams replied, but harder to implement. If we prosecute everyone involved, we'll have chaos. No government, no law enforcement, no organized authority of any kind. And if we don't prosecute them, Bear McKinnon added with characteristic bluntness, we'll have corruption, same as before, just with different faces on top. The debate was interrupted by the arrival of Marshal Henderson, who approached with the grim efficiency of a man dealing with a crisis that seemed to grow larger by the hour. Judge, he said without preamble, we've got problems. Word's gotten out about Noah Blackwood's testimony, and some of the names on his list are starting to panic. 3 territorial legislators tried to flee to Denver during the night. We caught 2 of them, but Senator Morrison got away. Williams rubbed his temples as if fighting a headache. What about the military connections? That's where it gets interesting, Henderson replied, pulling out a telegram from his pocket. Got this from Fort Collins about an hour ago. Seems Colonel Blackwood's been selling military supplies to whoever would pay, including some groups that aren't exactly friendly to the United States government. Carter's expression darkened. What kind of groups? Confederate sympathizers mostly. Men who never accepted that the war was over, but also some Mexican revolutionaries and at least one band of Comancheros operating out of New Mexico. The implications hit Clara like a physical blow. You're saying the Blackwoods were arming enemies of the United States? That's exactly what I'm saying, Henderson confirmed. Which means this isn't just a local corruption case anymore. It's a federal matter involving treason. Judge Williams looked as if he'd aged another decade in the past few minutes. Treason charges, that changes everything. We'll have federal prosecutors, military tribunals, possibly even congressional investigations. Good, Clara said firmly, ignoring the shocked looks from the men around her. Let the whole rotten edifice come down. Let everyone see what happens when good people stand by, and let evil flourish. Mrs. Whitmore, Williams said gently, I understand your feelings, but you may not fully grasp the consequences of what you're advocating. If this becomes a federal case, if we pursue treason charges, it could take years to resolve. Years during which Wyoming territory remains in legal limbo, unable to achieve statehood, unable to govern itself effectively. Better legal limbo than legal corruption, she replied without hesitation. Carter was studying her with something approaching admiration. You've thought this through. I've thought about nothing else since yesterday, she admitted. My husband came to this territory because he believed in the promise of America, that hard work and honest dealing would be rewarded, that the law would protect the innocent and punish the guilty. The Blackwoods perverted that promise, turned it into something ugly and self-serving. If we compromise now, if we let political considerations override justice, then we're just as guilty as they are. Two Hawks spoke up his accented English, carrying the weight of ancient wisdom. In the old days, when a chief became corrupt, the people would choose a new chief. The tribe was more important than any one man, even if that man wore the symbols of power. The Cheyenne have a point. Bear McKinnon agreed. Sometimes you gotta burn down the old to make room for the new. Williams was quiet for a long moment, studying the faces around him. Finally, he sighed deeply. Very well, we pursue full prosecution regardless of the political consequences. But I want everyone here to understand what that means. This territory is going to be under federal oversight for years to come. Every decision, every appointment, every law will be subject to review by Washington bureaucrats who've never set foot west of the Mississippi. That's a price worth paying, Clara said without hesitation. I hope you're right, Williams replied grimly, because once we start down this path, there's no turning back. Their conversation was interrupted by the approach of a familiar figure, Noah Blackwood, dressed in simple traveling clothes rather than the fine garments of his family's wealth. His face bore the marks of yesterday's violence, but more than that, it showed the deeper scars of a man who'd been forced to confront the evil in his own blood. Judge Williams, he said formally, I've come to surrender myself for trial. Surrender yourself? Williams looked confused. Mr. Blackwood, you're a witness, not a defendant. Your cooperation has been invaluable. My cooperation doesn't erase 15 years of complicity, Noah replied firmly. I knew what my family was doing. I may not have pulled triggers or signed fraudulent documents, but I stood by and let it happen. That makes me an accessory to everything they did. Clara felt a surge of respect for the young man. It would have been easy for him to hide behind his recent conversion to claim ignorance of his family's crimes. Instead, he was choosing to face the full consequences of his past choices. Noah, she said gently, what you did yesterday, standing up to your father and brother, testifying against them, that took more courage than most people have. It took 15 years too long, he replied bitterly. How many people suffered while I told myself I was just following orders, just being a loyal son? How many families were destroyed while I stood by and did nothing? Carter stepped forward, his pale eyes serious. Son, I've spent 15 years hunting your family, and I can tell you this, you're not your father or your brother. What you did yesterday proved that. Did it? Noah's laugh was bitter. Or did it just prove that I was a coward who finally got scared enough to do the right thing? Does it matter? Two Hawks asked quietly. A man's past cannot be changed, but his future remains his own to shape. The question is not what you were, but what you choose to become. Before Noah could respond, a commotion from the street drew their attention. A carriage was approaching the courthouse at high speed, its driver whipping the horses with obvious urgency. As it drew closer, Clara could see that it bore the official seal of the territorial governor. The carriage pulled to a stop in front of the courthouse steps, and a well-dressed man in his 50s emerged. Clara recognized him immediately. Governor Patterson, the territory's highest-ranking official, and a man she'd met briefly at social functions in Cheyenne. Judge Williams, Patterson called out as he ascended the steps, I need to speak with you immediately. This situation has gotten completely out of hand. Williams straightened, his judicial bearing asserting itself. Governor, if you're here to discuss the prosecution of the Blackwood case, I'm here to discuss the future of this territory. Patterson interrupted, his face flushed with anger and what might have been fear. Do you have any idea what your investigation is doing to our reputation back east? Investors are pulling out, federal funding is being questioned, and there's talk in Washington of postponing statehood indefinitely. Governor, Carter said mildly, are you suggesting that we should ignore treason and murder for the sake of public relations? Patterson's eyes fixed on Carter with obvious distaste. I'm suggesting that a wise man knows when to pursue justice and when to pursue stability. The Blackwoods are finished. Colonel Blackwood and his elder son will face trial for their crimes. But this witch hunt you're conducting, this investigation into every business dealing and political connection, it's destroying everything we've worked to build. Everything you've worked to build was built on corruption, Clara said firmly, stepping forward to face the governor directly. If it can't survive the light of truth, then it deserves to be destroyed. Patterson's face darkened as he recognized her. Mrs. Whitmore, isn't it? I understand you've had personal difficulties with the Blackwood family, but surely you can see that your desire for revenge shouldn't override the good of the entire territory. The condescension in his voice lit a fire in Clara's chest. Revenge, is that what you think this is about? What else could it be? Patterson replied dismissively. A grieving widow seeking to blame others for her husband's unfortunate death. He never finished the sentence. Clara's hand moved with surprising speed, connecting with the governor's cheek in a slap that echoed across the courthouse steps like a gunshot. My husband, she said, her voice deadly quiet, died of consumption brought on by the stress of fighting fraudulent land claims and water rights violations orchestrated by the Blackwood Cattle Company. He died knowing that corrupt officials were stealing everything he'd worked to build. And you, Governor Patterson, you dare to call his death unfortunate while defending the system that killed him. Patterson raised his hand to his reddening cheek, his eyes wide with shock. Around them, a crowd was beginning to gather, townspeople who'd heard raised voices and come to investigate. You struck a territorial governor. Patterson sputtered. I struck a corrupt politician, Clara replied without flinching. If you happen to hold the title of governor, that's merely an additional tragedy for the people of Wyoming. Judge Williams stepped between them before the situation could escalate further. Governor, perhaps we should continue this discussion in my chambers. There's nothing to discuss. Patterson snapped his composure, finally cracking completely. I'm ordering you to limit your investigation to the immediate crimes committed by Colonel Blackwood and his son. No fishing expeditions, no political investigations, no attempts to drag innocent public servants into this mess. You're ordering me. Williams' voice carried a dangerous edge. Governor, I think you've forgotten that the territorial judiciary is independent of the executive branch. I don't take orders from you. And I think you've forgotten who controls the territorial budget, Patterson shot back, including judicial salaries and court funding. The threat hung in the air like smoke from a battlefield. Clara could see the calculation in Williams's eyes, the weighing of principle against practical necessity. For a moment, she thought he might cave to the pressure. Instead, he smiled a cold, judicial smile that seemed to lower the temperature around them. Governor, he said quietly, are you attempting to bribe or threaten a federal judge in the performance of his duties? Patterson's face went white as he realized what he'd just said in front of witnesses. That's not what I meant. Because if you are, Williams continued implacably, that would constitute obstruction of justice, which is itself a federal crime. Judge Williams, Marshal Henderson said formally, did you want me to place the governor under arrest? The crowd that had gathered was growing larger, and Clara could see the realization dawning on their faces. Their own governor. The man they'd trusted to lead them toward statehood was as corrupt as the Blackwoods themselves. No arrest, Williams said finally. Not yet. But Governor, I strongly suggest you return to your office and review your legal position very carefully, because I suspect that before this investigation is over, you're going to need a very good lawyer. Patterson looked around at the hostile faces surrounding him, then back at Judge Williams. Without another word, he turned and stalked back to his carriage, his dignity in tatters. As the governor's carriage disappeared down the street, Noah Blackwood spoke up quietly. He's right about one thing, you know. This investigation is going to destroy the territorial government. Good, Bear McKinnon said bluntly. Government that corrupt deserves destroying. But what comes next, Noah asked. If we tear down everything that exists, what do we replace it with? It was Clara who answered, her voice carrying across the courthouse steps with surprising authority. We replace it with something better, something built on truth instead of lies, justice instead of favoritism, the rule of law instead of the rule of money. Easy to say, Two Hawks observed. Harder to do. The white man's government is like a great machine, many parts working together. When you break the machine, how do you make it work again? Carter was studying Clara with an expression she couldn't quite read. You're talking about revolution, not just reform. Maybe that's what this territory needs, she replied. Maybe that's what the whole country needs, a reminder that government exists to serve the people, not the other way around. Judge Williams was quiet for a long moment, obviously wrestling with the implications of what they were discussing. Finally, he spoke. Mrs. Whitmore, what you're suggesting, it would take years to implement. Years of federal oversight, military government, probably congressional hearings. Are you prepared for that kind of upheaval? Clara thought of Thomas, of their dreams for the ranch, of all the settlers who'd come west seeking a better life, only to find the same corruption they'd fled back east. She thought of the bodies in Cheyenne's streets, of the families destroyed by Blackwood greed, of all the people who'd suffered in silence because they believed they had no choice. Judge, she said finally, I spent yesterday learning that I'm stronger than I thought I was. Today I'm learning that sometimes strength means being willing to tear down what's broken, even if you're not sure what will replace it. Yes, I'm prepared for that kind of upheaval. Then we proceed, Williams said formally. Full investigation, complete prosecution, regardless of political consequences. Marshal Henderson, I want you to coordinate with federal authorities in Denver. We're going to need resources we don't currently have. What about the immediate situation? Henderson asked. We've got a territory without effective government, local officials who can't be trusted, and a population that's losing faith in the entire system. We improvise, Carter suggested. Military oversight for essential services, federal marshals for law enforcement, and citizen committees for local governance until new elections can be held. Citizen committees. Williams looked intrigued. That's actually not a bad idea. Direct democracy, at least temporarily. Clara felt a spark of excitement. Like the town meetings they used to hold back east. Everyone has a voice. Everyone gets to participate. The Cheyenne do this too, Two Hawks added. When important decisions must be made, the whole tribe comes together. Everyone speaks who wishes to speak, and then the people choose their path. It's not perfect, Noah observed, but it's better than what we had. The discussion was interrupted by the arrival of Captain Williams, who approached with obvious urgency. Judge, he said formally, we've received word from the federal prosecutors in Denver. They're sending a team to take over the investigation, and they want to interview all key witnesses within the week. How large a team? Williams asked. 12 prosecutors, 20 investigators, and a federal judge to oversee the proceedings. They're treating this as a major case. Clara felt a mixture of satisfaction and apprehension. The wheels of justice were finally turning, but she was beginning to understand the magnitude of what they'd set in motion. What about the immediate trials? She asked. Colonel Blackwood and Marcus, those will proceed as scheduled, Williams confirmed. Local crimes will be tried locally. The federal crimes will be tried in federal court. It's going to be complicated, but it's also going to be thorough. Over the next several hours, as news of the expanded investigation spread through Cheyenne, Clara watched the town transform itself. The fear and resignation that had characterized life under Blackwood rule was being replaced by something she'd never expected to see: hope. People who'd been afraid to speak out were suddenly volunteering information about Blackwood crimes. Business owners who'd been forced to pay protection money were demanding restitution. Families who'd lost loved ones to Blackwood violence were finally seeing the possibility of justice. But it wasn't just hope that was spreading through the town, it was also fear. Fear among those who'd collaborated with the Blackwoods, who'd taken their money or turned blind eyes to their crimes. Clara could see it in the faces of certain businessmen, in the way some territorial officials suddenly found urgent business elsewhere. The rats are leaving the sinking ship, Bear McKinnon observed as they watched another carriage loaded with luggage heading out of town. Let them go, Carter replied. The ones who run now are probably the small fish anyway. It's the ones who stay and try to brazen it out that we need to worry about. As if summoned by his words, a familiar figure appeared at the end of the street, Sullivan, the bounty hunter, walking slowly but steadily toward the courthouse. His left arm was still in a sling from his wound, but his right hand hung ready near his gun. Well, I'll be damned, Henderson muttered. Thought he was still laid up. Sullivan approached the courthouse steps with the measured pace of a man who'd made a difficult decision. When he reached the bottom step, he stopped and looked up at the group gathered there. Judge Williams, he said formally, I've come to turn myself in. Turn yourself in for what? Williams asked, though Clara suspected he already knew the answer. For every crime I've committed in the service of the Blackwood family over the past 10 years, Sullivan replied. Murder, intimidation, destruction of property. I've got a list if you want to see it. He pulled a folded paper from his pocket, and Clara could see that it was covered with writing in a careful, precise hand. Why? Noah asked quietly. Why confess now? Sullivan's smile was sad and bitter. Because yesterday, watching you stand up to your own family, watching that lady there put herself in harm's way for people she barely knew, it reminded me of something I'd forgotten. What's that? Clara asked. That a man's got to be able to look at himself in the mirror, Sullivan replied. And I haven't been able to do that for a long time. Judge Williams took the paper and scanned it quickly, his face growing more grave with each line. Mr. Sullivan, you realize that this confession could result in multiple death sentences. I realize that, Sullivan confirmed. I also realize that it's time to pay for what I've done. Clara found herself studying the bounty hunter's face, trying to reconcile this apparently repentant man with the monster who'd terrorized the territory for years. What changed your mind? Sullivan was quiet for a long moment. Yesterday, when you shot Marcus Blackwood to save his brother's life. That took courage, real courage, not the kind that comes from being bigger and meaner than everyone else, made me realize that I've been confusing fear with respect, violence with strength. It's not too late to choose differently, Carter said quietly. Maybe not, Sullivan agreed. But first I've got to answer for what I've already chosen. As Marshal Henderson took Sullivan into custody, Clara felt a strange mixture of emotions. Yesterday, this man had been her enemy, someone who would have killed her without hesitation. Today, he was just another human being trying to find his way back to something resembling honor. The afternoon brought a steady stream of visitors to the courthouse, federal marshals arriving from Denver territorial officials, demanding to know what was happening, and ordinary citizens who wanted to understand how their world was changing so rapidly. Clara found herself at the center of much of the attention as word spread that she was the woman who'd stood up to the Blackwoods in the town square. People wanted to hear her story to understand how a Boston widow had become the catalyst for such dramatic change. Mrs. Whitmore, came a voice behind her as she stood on the courthouse steps watching the sunset. She turned to see an elderly woman approaching her face bearing the lines of someone who'd lived through hard times. Yes, I'm Martha Cooper, the woman said. My husband was Judge Cooper, the one who was murdered for standing up to the Blackwoods 3 years ago. Clara felt her heart constrict. I'm so sorry for your loss. Don't be sorry, Martha replied firmly. Be proud. What you've done, what all of you have done, it means Henry didn't die for nothing. It means the Blackwoods can't hurt anyone else the way they hurt us. The simple words hit Clara harder than any elaborate speech could have. This wasn't about revenge or politics or territorial governance. It was about real people who'd suffered real losses and about the possibility that their sacrifices might finally have meaning. Mrs. Cooper, she said quietly, your husband's courage helped make yesterday possible. Men like him showed us that resistance was possible even when it seemed hopeless. And women like you showed us that resistance could succeed, Martha replied. Thank you, Mrs. Whitmore. Thank you for having the courage that the rest of us couldn't find. As Martha Cooper walked away, Clara felt the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders like a physical burden. She'd become more than just a participant in these events. She'd become a symbol of what was possible when ordinary people decided to stand up for what was right. Heavy thoughts, Carter asked, appearing beside her on the courthouse steps. Heavy responsibilities, she replied. I never asked to become a symbol of anything. None of us ask for the roles we're given, he observed. We just try to play them with honor. Clara was quiet for a moment, watching the last light fade from the western scapo. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new decisions, new tests of courage and conviction. But tonight, for the first time since Thomas died, she felt like she understood her purpose. Jonas, she said quietly, using his first name for the first time, that valley you mentioned, the one where you dreamed of building a home, is there room there for someone who wants to help build something new? His smile was answer enough, but he spoke anyway. Clara, There's room in that valley for anyone who believes in the possibility of a better world. As they stood together on the courthouse steps, surrounded by the evidence of their victory and the promise of the challenges to come, Clara realized that the frightened widow who'd begged people not to look at her was truly gone. In her place stood someone she was still learning to recognize, someone strong enough to face whatever tomorrow might bring. The reckoning was far from over, but it had begun, and that she thought was enough. 3 weeks later, the autumn wind carried the scent of sawdust and fresh paint through the streets of Cheyenne as the town rebuilt itself from the ashes of the Blackwood Empire. Clara stood at the window of the temporary courthouse watching carpenters raise the frame of a new schoolhouse where the old cattlemen's club had once stood. The symbolism wasn't lost on her. Where corruption had once held court, children would now learn to read and write and dream of a better future. "The federal prosecutor wants to see you," Judge Williams said, entering the room with the weary bearing of a man who'd spent 3 weeks drowning in legal documents. "They're ready to begin the formal proceedings." Clara nodded, smoothing down the simple blue dress she'd chosen for the occasion. Gone were the elaborate mourning clothes of her Boston days, replaced by practical garments suited to a woman who'd learned to rely on herself rather than society's expectations. The federal courthouse had been established in the Cheyenne Opera House, its grand stage now serving as a platform for a different kind of drama. As Clara entered the main hall, she was struck by the number of people who'd gathered to witness what the Denver newspapers were calling the trial of the century. Every seat was filled, and people stood along the walls and in the aisles, their faces reflecting a mixture of anticipation and solemnity. At the prosecution table sat a team of federal attorneys led by Marcus Reed, a sharp-featured man from Washington whose reputation for prosecuting corruption cases had preceded him to Wyoming. Across the aisle, Colonel Blackwood sat beside his court-appointed attorney, his once imposing figure diminished by 3 weeks in federal custody. His silver hair had grown unkempt, and his face bore the hollow look of a man who'd finally realized that his empire of influence couldn't save him from the consequences of his actions. Marcus Blackwood occupied a separate table, his own attorney whispering urgently in his ear. The younger Blackwood's arrogance had been replaced by something approaching panic as the full scope of the charges against him became clear: murder, conspiracy, treason, any one of which could result in a death sentence. "Mrs. Whitmore," Prosecutor Reed approached her as she took her seat in the witness section. "Are you prepared for what's coming? The defense is going to try to paint you as a vengeful widow whose personal grievances have blown this situation out of proportion." "Let them try," Clara replied calmly. "The evidence speaks for itself." "It does indeed," Reed agreed, gesturing toward the mountain of documents that covered the prosecution table. 3 weeks of investigation have uncovered a conspiracy that reaches from Wyoming to Washington, involving dozens of territorial officials, federal appointees, and military officers. The Blackwoods weren't just criminals. They were the center of a web of corruption that threatened the very foundation of territorial government. Noah Blackwood entered the courtroom at that moment, dressed in the simple clothes of a working man rather than the fine garments of his former life. He'd spent the past 3 weeks in protective custody, his testimony too valuable to risk, but also in a kind of limbo between his old identity and whatever he might become. "How is he holding up?" Clara asked, watching the young man take his seat at the prosecution table. "Better than expected," Reed replied. "Testifying against your own family takes a special kind of courage, but he seems determined to see this through." The proceedings began with Judge Morrison, the federal judge, who'd been sent from Denver to oversee the trial, calling the court to order. His voice carried the authority of a man who'd presided over some of the most important cases in the Western Territories. "Ladies and gentlemen," Judge Morrison began, "we are here today to determine the guilt or innocence of Gideon Blackwood and Marcus Blackwood on charges of conspiracy, murder, treason, and numerous other federal crimes. The evidence we will hear over the coming days will, I warn you, include testimony about acts of violence and corruption that may shock your sensibilities. But it is precisely because these allegations are so serious that they must be heard and judged by a jury of their peers." Prosecutor Reed's opening statement laid out the prosecution's case with methodical precision. The Blackwood Cattle Company, he explained, had been far more than a ranch operation. It had been a criminal enterprise that used violence and intimidation to seize land, corrupt officials to avoid prosecution, and even sold weapons to enemies of the United States to fund their operations. "The evidence will show," Reed declared, his voice carrying to every corner of the packed courtroom, "that the defendants stand at the center of a conspiracy that has corrupted territorial government, murdered innocent citizens, and endangered national security. This is not a case about business disputes or frontier justice. This is a case about treason, plain and simple." The defense attorney for Colonel Blackwood, a distinguished gentleman named Harrison Pierce, who'd been imported from Chicago, painted a very different picture in his opening statement. According to Pierce, his client was a successful businessman who'd been unfairly targeted by disgruntled competitors and vengeful enemies. Colonel Blackwood, Pierce argued, is a pillar of the community who helped bring civilization to the Wyoming wilderness. Yes, he made enemies, successful men always do. But the prosecution's case rests on the word of confessed criminals, disgruntled employees and individuals with personal vendettas against my client. Clara felt her anger rise as Pierce characterized her as a grieving widow whose personal losses have clouded her judgment. But she forced herself to remain calm, knowing that her moment would come. The first week of testimony focused on establishing the scope of the Blackwood conspiracy. Federal investigators presented evidence of fraudulent land claims, illegal water rights seizures, and systematic intimidation of homesteaders. Document after document was entered into evidence, creating a paper trail that stretched back 15 years. Sullivan, the former bounty hunter, proved to be a devastating witness for the prosecution. His detailed confession, corroborated by physical evidence and other testimony, painted a picture of an organization that operated more like a military unit than a business enterprise. Colonel Blackwood gave the orders. Sullivan testified, his voice steady despite the obvious strain of reliving his crimes. He'd identify targets, homesteaders who wouldn't sell businessmen, who wouldn't cooperate, officials who couldn't be bought. Then he'd send me and others to persuade them. And if persuasion didn't work, Prosecutor Reed asked. Sullivan's face was stone-like as he answered. Then we used other methods, burning barns, killing livestock, sometimes worse. How much worse? The courtroom held its breath as Sullivan paused, clearly struggling with the weight of his confession. 17 people died on Colonel Blackwood's orders over the past 10 years. Men, women, even a couple of children who were in the wrong place at the wrong time. A gasp went up from the gallery and Judge Morrison had to call for order. Clara felt sick to her stomach, thinking of all the families who'd suffered while the rest of the territory went about their business, either unaware of the violence or too frightened to speak out. The defense tried to discredit Sullivan by pointing out his criminal background and the deal he'd made with prosecutors in exchange for his testimony. But the physical evidence, weapons, documents, even photographs of crime scenes supported every detail of his account. Two Hawks testified about the systematic persecution of the Cheyenne people, describing how the Blackwoods had used false claims of Indian raids to justify seizures of tribal land. His testimony was particularly powerful because of his obvious reluctance to speak. It was clear he was testifying not for personal gain, but out of a sense of justice. They would dress their men as warriors, Two Hawks explained through an interpreter, though his English was adequate for most purposes. Attack homesteaders, leave arrow signs, make it look like Cheyenne work. Then they would come with soldiers, drive us from our lands, claim them for cattle grazing. Bear McKinnon's testimony focused on the military aspects of the conspiracy. As a former Army scout, he'd witnessed the sale of military supplies to Confederate sympathizers and Mexican revolutionaries. His gruff, no-nonsense delivery made him a credible witness, and his obvious disgust for the Blackwoods' betrayal of their country was evident in every word. A man who'd sell weapons to his country's enemies, Bear declared, staring directly at Colonel Blackwood. Ain't no better than a traitor in my book, and traitors deserve hanging. Captain Williams provided testimony about the corruption of territorial law enforcement. His evidence showed how the Blackwoods had systematically placed their allies in key positions, sheriffs, judges, territorial legislators, creating a network that could suppress investigation of their crimes. But it was Noah Blackwood's testimony that proved most damaging to the defense. Over 3 days on the witness stand, he methodically dismantled every attempt to portray his family as legitimate businessmen. His insider knowledge of the conspiracy, combined with his obvious reluctance to betray his blood, made him a compelling witness. Did your father ever explicitly order the murder of homesteaders who refused to sell their land? Prosecutor Reed asked. Noah's voice was barely above a whisper as he answered. Yes, I heard him give such orders on at least 6 occasions. And did you ever protest these orders? The young man's face crumpled with shame. No, I told myself it was just business that people got hurt in any competitive enterprise. I was a coward. What changed your mind? Noah looked across the courtroom to where Clara sat in the witness section. I watched Mrs. Whitmore stand up to armed men rather than submit to being treated as property. I realized that if a widow from Boston could find that kind of courage, I had no excuse for my cowardice. The defense's strategy became clear during their cross-examination of Noah. They painted him as an ungrateful son seeking to destroy his family out of jealousy and resentment, a weak man who'd turned traitor to save his own skin. Isn't it true, Blackwood, defense attorney Pierce asked, that you've always resented your father's success, that you saw an opportunity to destroy him and claim his empire for yourself? No, Noah replied firmly. I saw an opportunity to prevent more innocent people from being murdered. But you stood to inherit a substantial fortune when your father died, didn't you? By testifying against him, you ensure that fortune remains intact while eliminating him as an obstacle to your ambitions. The fortune you're talking about was built on blood money. Noah shot back, his voice rising for the first time during his testimony. I don't want any part of it. When Clara's turn came to testify, she felt surprisingly calm despite the hundreds of eyes focused on her. She'd spent weeks preparing for this moment, working with the prosecutors to organize her thoughts and evidence. Prosecutor Reed led her through her story methodically, her arrival in Wyoming, her husband's struggles with fraudulent claims against his ranch, his death from the stress and overwork of fighting the Blackwood conspiracy, and her own treatment at their hands. Mrs. Whitmore, Reed asked, when you stood up to the Blackwoods in Cheyenne's town square, did you understand the danger you were placing yourself in? I understood that I was already in danger, Clara replied. The Blackwoods had made it clear that they intended to take everything I had and reduce me to their property. I decided I'd rather die fighting than live as their chattel. What gave you the courage to make that choice? Clara thought for a moment before answering. I realized that my husband hadn't died from consumption, he'd died from injustice, and I decided that if his death was going to have any meaning, it would be because someone finally stood up and said, enough. The defense attorney's cross-examination was aggressive, as Reed had warned her it would be. Pierce tried to paint her as a vengeful widow, whose grief had distorted her judgment, whose testimony was motivated by personal hatred rather than concern for justice. Isn't it true, Mrs. Whitmore, that you blame the Blackwoods for your husband's death because you need someone to blame for your tragedy? I blame the Blackwoods for my husband's death because they killed him, Clara replied evenly. Not with a gun or a knife, but with a sustained campaign of legal harassment and fraudulent claims that destroyed his health and his will to live. But consumption is a disease, isn't it? Not something that can be caused by business disputes. Consumption is a disease that thrives on stress, poverty, and despair, Clara said firmly. The Blackwoods provided all three in abundance. Pierce pressed harder, trying to get her to admit that her testimony was motivated by revenge rather than justice. But Clara had spent weeks preparing for this moment, and she refused to let him shake her composure. And Whitmore, if the Blackwoods had offered you a generous settlement for your husband's ranch, would you have taken it and forgotten about pursuing these charges? No, Clara replied without hesitation, because this was never about money. It was about justice for all the families they destroyed, all the people they murdered, all the corruption they spread through this territory like a plague. The prosecution's case took 2 weeks to present, and by the end of it, the evidence of guilt seemed overwhelming. Documents, testimony from multiple witnesses, physical evidence, all of it pointed to a massive criminal conspiracy with the Blackwoods at its center. But the defense had one final card to play. On the last day of testimony, they called a surprise witness, Governor Patterson himself, who'd returned to Cheyenne under federal subpoena despite his obvious reluctance. Patterson's testimony was clearly designed to muddy the waters by suggesting that the federal investigation was a politically motivated attack on territorial autonomy. He painted the Blackwoods as scapegoats, being sacrificed to appease Eastern politicians who'd never understood frontier conditions. The Blackwoods were harsh men, Patterson testified, but they were frontier men. They did what was necessary to bring order to a lawless territory. To judge them by the gentle standards of Boston drawing rooms, is to misunderstand the reality of life in Wyoming. But Patterson's credibility was undermined by his own obvious corruption. Under aggressive cross-examination, Prosecutor Reed forced him to admit taking substantial contributions from the Blackwood Cattle Company, using his office to protect their interests and attempting to obstruct the federal investigation. The trial's climax came during closing arguments. Prosecutor Reed's summation was a masterpiece of legal oratory, weaving together the evidence into a narrative of systematic corruption and violence that had poisoned territorial government. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Reed declared, "the evidence before you describes nothing less than a criminal conspiracy that treated human life as a commodity and government office as private property. The defendants didn't just break the law, they corrupted the very institutions meant to enforce the law, turning justice itself into another tool of oppression." Defense attorney Pierce made a valiant effort to save his clients, arguing that they were victims of a federal power grab designed to delay Wyoming's statehood and maintain Washington's control over territorial affairs. "My clients are not angels," Pierce admitted. "They are hard men who lived in hard times and made hard choices, but they are not traitors and they are not murderers. They are scapegoats being sacrificed to political expediency." The jury deliberated for 2 days. When they finally returned to the courtroom, the tension was so thick Clara could feel it like a physical weight pressing down on her chest. Judge Morrison called for order as the jury foreman stood to deliver the verdict. "On the charge of conspiracy to commit murder." The foreman read his voice carrying clearly through the silent courtroom. "We find the defendant Gideon Blackwood guilty." A murmur ran through the gallery, quickly silenced by the judge's gavel. "On the charge of treason against the United States," the foreman continued, "we find the defendant Gideon Blackwood guilty." One by one, the verdicts were read guilty on all counts for both Colonel Blackwood and his son Marcus. The evidence had been too overwhelming, the testimony too detailed, the documentation too complete for any other outcome. When the verdicts were finished, Judge Morrison called for order once more before delivering the sentences. His voice was grave as he addressed the defendants. "Gideon Blackwood, you have been found guilty of crimes that strike at the very heart of our democratic institutions. You have murdered innocent citizens, corrupted public officials, and betrayed your country's trust. For these crimes, this court sentences you to death by hanging." Colonel Blackwood's face remained impassive as he heard his fate pronounced, but Clara saw his hands tremble slightly as he gripped the edge of the defendant's table. "Marcus Blackwood," the judge continued, "you have been found guilty of participating in your father's conspiracy, including the murders of federal officials and territorial citizens. This court sentences you to death by hanging." Unlike his father, Marcus broke down completely at the pronouncement of his sentence, sobbing openly as the bailiffs moved to restrain him. "Both sentences will be carried out at dawn on the 15th of October in accordance with federal law and territorial custom." As the courtroom erupted in a mixture of cheers and gasps, Clara felt no satisfaction, only a profound weariness. Justice had been served, but at such a terrible cost, so many lives lost, so many families destroyed, so much suffering that could have been prevented if good people had found their courage sooner. The next few days passed in a blur of interviews with newspaper reporters, meetings with federal officials, and preparation for the executions that would finally close this chapter of Wyoming's history. Clara found herself at the center of much of the attention portrayed in the Eastern papers as a symbol of frontier justice and democratic renewal. But it was a conversation with Noah Blackwood that affected her most deeply. They met in the hotel dining room on the evening before the executions, both struggling with the weight of what was about to happen. "I keep thinking about when we were children," Noah said quietly, staring into his untouched coffee. "Marcus and I, before everything went wrong. He wasn't always cruel. There was a time when he protected me from schoolyard bullies, when he taught me to ride and shoot and fish." "What changed him?" Clara asked gently. "Father," Noah replied simply. "Father convinced him that the world was divided into predators and prey, that showing mercy was a sign of weakness. Marcus wanted so desperately to please him, to prove he was strong enough to inherit the empire Father had built. And you?" Noah's smile was bitter. "I was always the disappointment. Too soft, Father said. Too concerned with what other people thought. He never realized that what other people thought mattered because other people mattered." "What will you do now?" Clara asked. "I don't know," Noah admitted. I have money that didn't come from the Blackwood Empire, money I inherited from my mother's family back east. I've been thinking about using it to help the families that suffered under my father's rule. Try to make some small amends for 15 years of cowardice." "That's not cowardice," Clara said firmly. "That's atonement, and it takes more courage than you realize." The executions were held at dawn, as was traditional. Clara forced herself to attend, feeling she owed it to Thomas and all the other victims to witness the end of the men who'd caused so much suffering. The gallows had been erected in the same town square where her humiliation had begun this entire chain of events, and she couldn't help but notice the symmetry. A crowd had gathered despite the early hour, some seeking justice, others mere entertainment, but all united in their recognition that they were witnessing a historical moment. Colonel Blackwood walked to the scaffold with his head high, refusing the blindfold and maintaining his dignity even in the face of death. Marcus was less composed, requiring support from the guards as he climbed the steps. "Any last words?" the federal marshal asked. Colonel Blackwood looked out over the crowd, his eyes finally finding Clara among the faces staring up at him. For a moment she thought she saw something like regret in his expression. "I built an empire," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the morning air. "I brought order to chaos, civilization to wilderness. History will judge whether the cost was worth paying." Marcus said nothing, his face pale with terror as the noose was placed around his neck. The executions were carried out with swift efficiency. Clara watched without flinching, though she felt no satisfaction in the deaths of these men. They had chosen their path and it had led them here, but their deaths wouldn't bring back the people they'd murdered or heal the damage they'd done to Wyoming territory. As the crowd dispersed and the bodies were taken away, Clara found herself standing alone in the town square where this had all begun. The sun was rising over the eastern mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that reminded her of the fires that had raged during the battle for Cheyenne. "It's finished," came a voice behind her, and she turned to see Carter approaching. His pale eyes were somber as he studied the now empty gallows. "This part is finished," Clara corrected, "but there's still so much work to do. New officials to elect, new laws to write, new institutions to build. The Blackwoods are gone, but the problems they exploited are still here." "That's true," Carter agreed. "But at least now we have the chance to build something better. That's more than we had a month ago." Two hawks appeared beside them, his arm finally out of its sling, though he still moved carefully. "The evil chief is dead," he observed. "But the tribe must still decide what kind of chief to choose next." Over the following weeks, as federal administrators worked to establish new territorial governance and prepare for eventual statehood, Clara found herself increasingly involved in the process of rebuilding. Her experience with the Blackwood conspiracy, combined with her obvious integrity and courage, made her a natural choice for various committees and advisory positions. But it was her growing relationship with Jonas Carter that occupied most of her thoughts. The man who'd rescued her from humiliation in the town square had become something much more important, a partner in every sense of the word, someone who shared her vision of what Wyoming could become. "The valley's beautiful this time of year," he said one evening as they stood on the hotel balcony watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of purple and gold. Snow on the peaks, grass in the meadows, and enough silence to hear yourself think. "It sounds perfect," Clara replied and realized she meant it. The sophisticated pleasures of Boston society seemed pale and artificial compared to the raw beauty of the Wyoming wilderness. "There's a house there," Carter continued. "Nothing fancy, just a simple log cabin with a good well and a view of the mountains, room to expand if the need arose." Clara understood what he was asking and felt her heart begin to race. "Jonas, are you?" "Clara Whitmore," he said formally, turning to face her directly. "Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Would you help me build something good and honest in that valley, something that could stand as a monument to all the people we've lost?" She looked into his winter-pale eyes and saw not the haunted gunfighter who'd rescued her from the Blackwoods, but a man who'd found his way back to hope and humanity through their shared struggle for justice. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I will." Their wedding took place a month later in the new church that had been built to replace the one damaged during the battle for Cheyenne. It was a simple ceremony attended by the allies who'd fought beside them, Two Hawks in his finest ceremonial dress, Bear McKinnon clean-shaven for the occasion, Judge Williams performing the service, and Noah Blackwood serving as an unexpected but welcome witness. Do you, Clara, take Jonas to be your husband, to stand beside him in whatever challenges the future may bring? I do, Clara replied, thinking of all the challenges they'd already faced together, all the battles they'd fought and won. And do you, Jonas, take Clara to be your wife, to build with her the kind of life that honors the memory of those we've lost? I do, Carter replied, his voice steady and strong, as they exchanged rings made by the local blacksmith from Silver Mine in the nearby mountains. Clara felt something she hadn't experienced since Thomas's death, complete and perfect happiness. Not the fragile contentment of her Boston days, but something deeper and more durable, forged in the crucible of shared struggle and mutual respect. The reception was held in the hotel dining room, transformed for the occasion with wildflowers and bunting. There were speeches and toasts, laughter, and even some tears as people reflected on how far they'd all come from the dark days of Blackwood rule. To the bride and groom! Two Hawks declared, raising his glass of the local whiskey that had replaced the fancy imported liquors of the Cattlemen's Club. May their lodge fires burn bright, and may their children grow strong in the land of their fathers. To new beginnings, Judge Williams added, and to the proof that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they find the courage to stand for what's right. As the evening wore on and the guests gradually departed, Clara found herself alone with her new husband on the hotel balcony, looking out over the town they'd helped transform. Cheyenne was still rebuilding, still growing, still learning what it meant to be governed by law rather than force. But it was free, and that made all the difference. No regrets? Jonas asked, slipping his arm around her waist. Clara thought of the frightened widow who'd begged people not to look at her in this very town square, of the woman who'd followed a domineering husband west because she had no other options, of all the dreams that had died with Thomas in their little ranch house. No regrets, she said firmly. That woman died the day I stood up to the Blackwoods. The woman standing here now chose her own path, fought her own battles, and found her own happiness. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge in the clear Wyoming sky. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, the Valley Ranch to build new settlers, to welcome the continuing work of creating just and honest government for the territory. But tonight was theirs, earned through courage and sacrifice, and the unshakable belief that ordinary people could change the world. In the distance, a coyote howled its ancient song to the moon, and Clara smiled at the wild, free sound of it. She was home at last, not the home she'd planned or expected, but the home she'd chosen and fought for and made her own. The war was over, the healing had begun, and under the vast Wyoming sky anything seemed possible.